At the 2017 Chase Encounters at UEA, I sat on a panel of creative critical PhD students discussing the relationship between the creative and critical aspects of their research. Those of you who were there may remember that the critical part of my PhD is a survey of English language translations of a single Tang Dynasty poem that had once been given to me on a calligraphic scroll. This poem and its author could be known by multiple different names. As I represent them to you today, for the sake of clarity and brevity, I'm going to keep it simple. The poem is called Yellow Crane Tower, sending off Meng Haoran to Guangling. It was written by Li Bai. There are many different translations of the poem, so please be patient while I read out a few of them. From Yellow Crane Tower, my old friend leaves the west. Downstream to Yangzhou, late spring, a haze of blossoms. Distant glints of lone sail vanish into emerald green air. Nothing left but a river flowing on the borders of heaven. Yellow Crane Terrace, my old friend bids me goodbye. To Yangzhou in the mists and flowers of spring he goes. His single sail's far shadow melts in the blue void. All I see is the sky to which the Yangtze flows. My old friend takes off from the Yellow Crane Tower. In smoke flower third month down to Yangzhou. A lone sail, a distant shade, lost in the blue horizon. Only the long Yangtze is seen flowing into the sky. My old friend, going west, bids farewell at Yellow Crane Terrace. Among misty blossoms of the third month, goes down to Yangzhou. His lone sail's far shadow vanishes into the azure void. Now only the long river flowing to the sky's end. Some middling translations, some good translations. But I'm not here to talk about good translations today. I'm here to present two very bad linked translations of this poem and analyse the continuities between them. Now, these two translations are intended to appear in a chapter of my critical piece that looks at the discourse surrounding literary modernism in the Occidentalist counter-discourse in post-modern China. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that. You may be familiar with Orientalism. Edward Said's monumental book describes the ways in which the West has defined itself against an othered Orient, and in so doing justified its own imperial ambitions. You may not have come across Chen Xiaomei's Occidentalism. This is a term that she defines within this book. She defines the Occidentalist counter-discourse as a discursive practice that, by constructing its Western other, has allowed the Orient to participate actively and with indigenous creativity in the process of self-appropriation, even after being appropriated and constructed by Western others. She uses the word Orient here, but her focus is post-modern China. Just as Orientalism describes the ways in which Westerners understand themselves in relation to an othered Orient, Chen's concept of Occidentalism describes the way by which a Chinese person might understand themselves in relation to a Western other. So these are grand concepts that are going to largely stay in the background of today's presentation. I'm going to focus on one way in which people define themselves in relation to the other. That is the way in which cultural capital is invested in the mastery or apparent mastery of another language. I'd like to give you an example of that. Those of you who are at the 2017 Encounters conference may remember that I dragooned keynote speaker Giles Foden into holding my scroll while I read the poem out in Mandarin Chinese, and people applauded. I was a bit embarrassed that people applauded, and even though I loved it, I did try to stop it from happening. I was reminded that many people succeed in speaking English as a second, third, fourth language every day. And the part of me that suffers from a certain Foucaultian paranoia felt the urge to disclaim or even condemn what felt like a manifestation of my multifarious privileges. But I thought it over and I've decided not to, because it would have been ungracious. and because we should always encourage and applaud efforts to research and imaginatively explore other languages, cultures and perspectives. So I thank you for applauding 2017. But the applause I received led me to think about the ways in which the mastery or apparent mastery of another language can provide a degree of cultural capital. For example, I used to live in Beijing. I was a Lawai, an old outsider, a foreigner. As a Lawai, I anxiously observed other Lawais. I observed that the hipster Lawais in reconstructed Beijing hutongs took one another's measure based on their apparent assimilation with Chinese culture, especially the mastery of the language, as Yoroshiho manifest in the Heshila insertion of appropriated Zhongwen into the vernacular. And if you don't know what I'm saying, you probably found that a bit annoying. But you may agree with the general statement that it is cool to speak another language, and doing so provides domestic cultural capital, and cultural capital can translate to economic success. And my presence here is a testament to the fact that the Academy rewards it. I'd like to shelve this thought about using the other and the language and culture of the other as a source of domestic cultural capital, because I will have recourse to return to it later on. On to the bad translations and their creators, the bad translators. Herbert Giles was a British diplomat in Qing Dynasty China, and latterly a professor of Chinese at Cambridge University. He was a pugnacious character who held provocative opinions, often based on personal animus. He detested missionaries and perhaps consequently downplayed missionary claims about opium and female infanticide in China. His career was set back when he got involved in a fist fight with his Chinese co-judge at the Shanghai Mixed Court. Please imagine these two men getting up off their thrones and throwing one another about. Savor that image. Okay. At the Yellow Crane Pagoda, where we stopped to bid adieu, the mists and flowers of April seemed to wish good speed to you. At the Emerald Isle, your lessening sail had vanished from my eye and left me with the river rolling onward to the sky. 2 points. First, Giles's translation rhymes. We can characterize the choice to employ rhyme as part of a domesticating translation strategy in line with Giles's ideas of what his readership expected from poetry. Regarding his readership, Giles was on point. His translations were successful at the time, and it's only in the light of later modernist sensibilities that readers today might find his rhyme and syntax unloaded. My second point, Giles's translations are not accurate. Sometimes the inaccuracy was the result of the limitations of sinology and language studies at the time, and sometimes Giles would change the meaning of poems in order to fit them into his rhyme scheme. The insertion of Emerald Isle here is a concrete example of where the needs of prosody overrode fidelity to the original. It has been inserted as a rhythmic counterpart to lessening sail. While lessening sail is a fine, accurate translation, Emerald Isle is an aberration that only exists because it scans. In terms of scholarship, the work done by Said in Orientalism makes locating a figure like Giles relatively easy. His representations of China were both facilitated and compromised by his position in the British Empire. And his frequent fights with fellow sinologists made clear his urgent need to establish mastery of a contested field. China was a career for him, and his book of translated poems was part of a body of works based on his observations of the place. By comparison, there are relatively few kind of methodological models to locate our next translator, who's Su Yuan-Chong, who's a Chinese translator, apparently still at Peking University, despite the fact that he's 98. He is a respected translator who has won multiple prizes for his work, which includes translating Proust, Flaubert, and Stendhal. Unusually, however, he has published a lot of translations from classical Chinese into English, despite the fact that his native tongue is not English. And this is not translatorial standard practice. So his 2014 Selected of Works of Li Bai contains a version of Yellow Crane Tower that exemplifies the risks of this choice. My friend has left the west where towers yellow crane. For river town where willow down and flowers rain, his lessening sail is lost in the boundless blue sky, where I see but the endless river rolling by. Okay, 2 points. First, Sue's translation rhymes. Not only does this translation rhyme like Giles's, the rhyme distorts the meaning. However, in this case the meaning is distorted to the point where essentially it breaks. In Tower's Yellow Crane, the word tower becomes a misplaced verb in order to rhyme crane with rain. There's no justification for this choice. Second, like Giles, Sue uses some archaic syntax and vocabulary. The words but and rain here have connotations of the medieval. So based on these two observations, it should come as no surprise to learn that Su Yuan-chong has encountered the work of H.A. Giles. He wrote about it as early as 1984, and this very poem contains a telling sign of conscious or unconscious influence, the word choice lessening sail. Maybe. Because I cannot in good conscience say that Su has directly emulated Giles. He has articulated his own translation theory based on a tripartite model of beauty in meaning, sound, and form. The theory justifies the use of rhyme in translation as an effort to recreate beauty in sound. Su claimed to have derived this theory from modernist scholar Lu Sun. However, as a model, it does feel like a throwback to traditional Chinese literary paradigms with its tripartite structure and reliance on evaluative descriptors based on instinct. Indeed, it's arguably a recycling of an ancient way of thinking about the Chinese character, but it's been repurposed to talk about translation of poetry instead. Therefore, although I cannot in good conscience say that Su has directly emulated Giles, I can say that Giles's influence is a factor in a rather indiscriminately retrograde approach to translation, which marries the intellectual paradigms of various pasts to a consciously archaic style. I'd like to talk about my personal response to this poem and the other one. It makes me want to roll around on the floor like Ford Maddox Ford. It's as if modernism never happened. And that's an interesting thing to me because modernism happened and Chinese poetry was really central to it. And this poem was translated in one of the kind of central texts of Anglophone literary modernism, Cathay by Ezra Pound. Ko-jin goes west from Kokaku-ro, the smoke flowers are blurred over the river. His lone sail blots the far sky, and now I see only the river, the Longqiang, reaching heaven. Although he turned out to be a fascist lunatic, Ezra Pound was a monumental figure in Anglophone literary modernism, and his collection Cathay, from which this poem is taken, was a landmark publication. Pound read Giles. He modelled his earlier efforts on Giles, but Pound made no effort to explain medieval China as if it were a real place. The Cathay that Pound represents and to a certain extent fetishizes is an oblique jumble, a space of exotic unknowability, reminiscent of yellow pattern plates and other items of consumer culture known as chinoiserie. In stylistic terms, Cathay is important in ways too numerous to list now. In terms of cultural interchange, Pound and his contemporaries also ushered in a new movement of poets who appropriated Zen Buddhism into Western counterculture. It's pretty major. And all of this has formed a set of poetic, aesthetic and philosophical precepts that I suppose I must have internalized as a child of counterculture, a student of modernism and a conscious being in the postmodern moment. And these precepts mediated my response to Giles and Sue's translations, which were dismissal and dismay. And I think this is one of the definitions of culture shock, perhaps, when you notice the absence of something so fundamental that you never articulated it before to yourself. So, out of this immediate reaction, I came to two questions. Who is Su Yuan-chong's intended readership? And what is the status of literary modernism in the Chinese Academy? And I'm not going to try and answer the second one today, but I'll try to get to the first one. So, while I was comparing the Chinese and English language versions of Su Yuan-Chong's foreword to the selected poems of Li Bai, trying to work out more about his methodology, I came across a passage in which Su analyses the significance of the Yellow Crane Tower, but the English language version that he translated himself is significantly less sophisticated than the Chinese version. There is a literary term in it that Su chooses not to unpack for his English-speaking readership. Now, this made me lose a lot of trust in Su as a translator. The errors in his poetry seemed completely forgivable to me when he was translating medieval Chinese into English. That was fine. But why? What felt strange was that there was no commitment to his readership. He was translating his own work from modern Chinese into English. Then I had another idea. What if the question of Su's commitment to his English-speaking readership was irrelevant? What if English speakers were not in fact his target readership? What if the text had a target audience of patrons and facilitators, otherwise of academic economic product, who are not themselves readers, but for whom the putative English-speaking readership is a foil? That would be to say, these patrons or facilitators, like the Lawais and the Beijing Hutongs, take apparent fidelity to a foreign language or culture as a marker of cultural capital. The putative English-speaking reader might have been as illusory as the fictitious Chinese person I would imagine impressing with each new piece of Mandarin vocabulary when I learnt it. As if I was going to accost someone in the street and say, "Woman, 一起去动物园," because I was never going to do that. I was too shy. I was also too aware of my subjectivity as just another Lawai in Beijing. But Su wasn't just showing off his language skills because they were cool. His knowledge of English was being put to use in the context of academic production. It's a feature, not a quirk of the academy, that its institutions conspire to bring about the creation of academic economic product for which there is no discernible readership. Su Yuan-Chong's translations have all the hallmarks of an academic economic product devised in line with bureaucratically established targets. One might speculate as to the ultimate goal of the product, and my bet would be the promotion of Chinese culture as soft power. Now, to perceive that I was not the intended reader of this work, and that I was merely a witness to what was essentially a domestic communication, was an important realization for me. This perspectival shift gave me a better understanding of what Chen Xiaomei's Occidentalist counter-discourse might mean in practice. And so doing it prepared me for later reading about literary modernism in post-Mao China, and how the debate surrounding it became, in an environment of hyper-nationalist paranoia, a proxy argument about the toxic influence of Western individualism, and how the debate became so dangerous that a translator in Su Yuan-Chong's position might have made the strategic decision to avoid it entirely by modelling the translatorial strategy instead on a prominent pre-modernist translator, somebody perhaps like Giles. But since I'm out of time, that's a story for another day.